Hello, welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, I'm going to review America's worst budget airline, a total disaster. I'm curious to know what this video about. Before I get into the video, make sure you subscribe to my channel and like the video. Let's get to the video.
Would you ever fly on America's worst airlines? Because according to Google, Frontier and Spirit were voted the worst budget airlines in the entire country. But how bad can they really be, and which is truly the worst? First up today, we're going to be flying Frontier, and I have never flown them before, so I have no idea what they're like. But when I was doing the online check-in process, we got off to a pretty decent start. After getting the check-in email, I confirmed who I was and proceeded to the next step, where Frontier tried to sell me bundles, seating which was absurdly expensive just to pick where I wanted to be, before harassing me with even more add-ons they wanted me to buy. But probably the most insane thing is that if you want in-person check-in, you gotta pay $20. So I skipped this and decided to just complete the check-in instead. So now that we're all checked in, we're gonna head inside and grab the boarding pass. And remember, after this flight, we're gonna be flying Spirit to figure out which is actually the worst in all of America. But it is way too early for this. It's like 4:30 in the morning. So after making my way into the airport, I began looking for the Frontier area, which was completely empty because of the $20 you needed to pay to use them, but there were these kiosks. So naturally, I tried to use them to check in, but it turns out that these are only for your checked bags. And the only way to get your boarding pass is printing it off beforehand or using their mobile app. Well, that was one of the weirdest check-in processes I have ever done. I have flown a lot of budget airlines like Spirit, Ryanair, and a bunch of others, and no matter how bad they're rated, you could actually print your boarding pass at a kiosk or in person. So it's kind of strange, but at least we got it. And today we're actually TSA pre-checked approved, which means security is going to be super quick. So let's go do that now, and then we'll be able to find our gate before boarding the Frontier flight. And since I was TSA pre-checked, I made my way through security at a record pace, and luckily my flight was still on time for today. You know, I'm starting to realize that maybe it's just the Canadian and European airports that don't like me, because security here was super fast, and every single time I've gone to the States, I don't think I've been double inspected yet, but whenever I fly out of Canada or Europe, I'm always getting randomly selected. So I guess I just look suspicious in those two places. And you see, normally at this point, I'd be looking for a lounge, but because Frontier is a budget airline and on the smaller side, they don't have any lounges in their terminal, because the way these budget airlines work is they're usually in the crappier terminals. So it looks like we're just gonna have to...
With the next day shipping and easy returns. Shop Pretty Little Thing.
Why pay for internet with slower uploads?
Frontier Fiber gives you equal speeds.
Switch to Frontier Fiber Internet.
In fact, most budget airline flights are first thing in the morning because it is cheapest for them to use the airport at this time. So all of the stores were closed, including food, which sucks, but that's what happens when you get to the airport at 5:30 in the morning for a 6:35 a.m. flight. And while we're on the topic of budget airlines, I'm going to explain to you exactly what they are because they operate a little bit different from a normal airline. And if you've never flown them before or just don't understand how they work, it can be confusing and frustrating. So basically, a budget airline is extremely cheap for the base fare, but if you want to bring a carry-on or any checked bag, you're going to be paying a lot of money. On top of that, during the flights themselves, the seats are generally awful. Food and drinks aren't included, but it still does get you from point A to point B. But anyways, my flight is supposed to board now in about 15 minutes, but before we do that, I want to read you guys some of the reviews about Frontier, just so we can understand why everyone says they are so terrible. Right off the bat, Frontier is ranked last in America, but to make things worse, they're closing check-in and bag drops earlier than any other airline. They're ranked #1 for kicking people off the plane and forcing them onto another flight, along with the highest passenger complaint rate in all of 2022. But it gets worse. They've even completely canceled their customer service call line, have more terrible reviews than any other category combined, and because of this, people have said this about them and that they are literally the worst airline ever. So obviously after reading those, I am slightly terrified, but it is now time to finally board. So let's see how bad...
Yeah, I'm slightly terrified for you. Boy, I hope he makes it. I really do.
Frontier actually is. And after making my way through the airport, when I got to the gate, it was just in time because boarding had begun. But now, while I was in line, I noticed a little bit of a commotion because the Frontier staff were pulling people aside to make them size their bags. And if the bags were even slightly too big, then people were being charged. Morning.
Hi.
How are you? Thank you.
Nice to meet you.
Damn, that's crazy. They made me show my backpack because they thought it was oversized, even though this one has been flying on Spirit, Ryanair, and pretty much any airline I've ever flown on. Questionable start. And I don't want to be that guy, but things are about to get much worse. Morning.
Morning.
So after making my way through the cabin, I noticed there were two types of seats, where the nicer ones looked like this, but the ones where I'd be sitting looked more like this. And eventually I made my way to my seat. Right off the bat, doing an initial comfort test, things didn't seem to be too bad, but the seat was definitely on the harder side. And one thing I did notice was how thin these seats were, and it was basically a piece of fabric over top of a plastic tub. And for some reason, the space for bags underneath the seat also weren't the greatest. And on top of that, these seats definitely wouldn't be reclining. So right off the bat, the seating is basically a copy paste of Spirit, but somehow it is actually kind of worse. There is less leg room, less bag room, and the tray tables are way smaller. Now, one thing that was extremely disappointing was that I knew for a fact this was the first flight of the day, since it was so early in the morning, but still things were quite dirty. Now, one of the plus sides I did notice that since carry-on baggage costs so much extra, there was tons of space in the overhead bins. But as I made my way to check out the reading lamp, even though it was working, it appeared the AC was off for the entire cabin, which in the Florida heat quickly became a sauna. But soon enough, we were pushing back from the gate and making our way towards the runway. For the first flight of the day, I was going to be flying from Fort Lauderdale, Florida to Atlanta, Georgia. And soon after making it to the runway, it was time to get into the sky. Now that I was in the air, I decided to look around and explore when I noticed some messy patches on the seat, but also the tray table. I'll be honest here, this is the smallest thing I have ever seen on any airline I've flown. In fact, it is so small that my iPhone is literally longer than this thing, and on top of that, it was also rusting with some pretty gross stuff inside. Now, under the tray table, the stains continued onto the back of the seat, and I really don't want to know what this even is, but at least the safety pamphlet was normal. But anyways, now that I've been flying for a while, I noticed that the seat was starting to dig into my sides, which was extremely painful on my back. So I decided to head to the bathroom for a break, but things only got worse from here. After getting to the bathroom, it looked like every single one of the panels was hanging on for your dear life, thanks to a tape job, which, you know, is slightly concerning. And on top of that, things were quite disgusting, but at least there was decent headroom. Anyways, after making it back to my seat, we had begun our descent, but little did I know that things were about to get worse after we landed.
What can be worse?
For some reason, as we taxied to the gate, we ended up stopping because there was another Frontier plane parked in our gate. So we ended up waiting for nearly an hour. During this time, people began walking around and were getting quite frustrated. But finally, we began moving again and arrived at our gate. Thank you.
I booked a
rustic cabin in Vermont.
Beach.
Well, that's good too.
That's nice, but it's okay.
Holy shit, that was brutal. So we ended up being stuck on the runway for about an hour. And to make matters worse, those seats were incredibly uncomfortable. The way it was finally solved was they had to tow away another Frontier plane so we could take its gate. And I don't know if it's Frontier's fault or the airport. And I'm sure some of you guys know way better than me, but I don't want to be too quick to blame Frontier just in case it's not their fault. But regardless, that flight was pretty brutal. The seats were super uncomfortable. The tray table was basically non-existent. It was also super messy, but the one plus side is that the staff were actually really friendly. But now that we're all done with Frontier, it's time to see how Spirit compares. And so far, doing the online check-in process actually went surprisingly well. After getting the check-in email, I was offered money in order to take a different flight home, which I decided to pass on. So after getting harassed with add-ons and agreeing to having no hazardous materials, I was all checked in and ready to go. But now obviously Frontier had a good check-in process too, and we saw how the flight ended up going. So it's going to be super interesting to see how Spirit compares, but first we're going to go check out a lounge because I definitely need it after that flight. I'm probably going to go insane if Spirit's just as bad. So after making my way to the airport, I arrived at the Club Atlanta. For breakfast, there was cereal, oatmeal, eggs, and a bunch of other things. So I decided to load up along with a massive glass of alcohol. And after exploring the lounge a bit and seeing what it had to offer, it was time to head back towards my gate. So I've been to that lounge before, and I thought this time it might be better, but it's still a solid 4 out of 10. It's a little bit dated, the food options are extremely limited, and on top of that, the food just really isn't the greatest. greatest. Another thing that I found super weird about that lounge too is they had a wait list even though it was practically empty. But the one silver lining is that the staff were quite friendly. But anyways, my Spirit flight is now supposed to board in about 15 minutes, but I wanted to read you guys some of the reviews just so we could all understand why they're so bad. Right off the bat, people rate Spirit just above Frontier, but they're both still ranked at the bottom in all of America. In fact, people rate Spirit so low that articles have been written about how passengers should avoid them entirely, with reviews saying it was the worst flight experience people have ever had, to not use Spirit, and one person even wrote about how it was their first and last flight. So now that we know how people feel about them, fingers crossed they aren't going to be as bad as Frontier, but it is going to be super interesting to see how they compare. So after making my way through the massive airport in Atlanta, I eventually found my gate, which said things were still on time, but in typical Spirit fashion, it turns out that things were actually running late. The flight coming in arrived nearly an hour late when my original flight was supposed to be leaving. And after another 30 minutes of waiting around, it was finally time to get on board the Spirit flight. There you go.
How you doing?
Good, you?
Sure.
Appreciate that. Have a good one. It's time to see which is worse, Frontier or Spirit. We are in for an adventure. So after boarding the plane and not being greeted, I made my way through the cabin towards my seat when I noticed this was an older aircraft, which is good because these seats are better than the ones on the newer Spirit planes. By no means are these seats perfect, but after an initial comfort test, things appear to be all right. And the main downside I'd say is that the headrests were a bit on the stiffer side. Now, all things considered, since this was an older aircraft, things were in pretty decent shape, other than a few spots and stains on the seat, but unfortunately, the leg room was pretty tight. Another thing that was also a plus for Spirit is that there is pretty good room under the seats for bags, and plenty in the overhead. And that's because most people don't spend the money for a carry-on. But since we were running late, soon enough we were fully boarded and pushing back from the gate to try and make up some lost time. For the second flight of the day, I was going to be flying from Atlanta back to Fort Lauderdale in Florida, and after arriving at the runway, soon enough we were making our way into the sky.
Woo! Congratulations!
Now that we were in the air, the first thing I wanted to check out was the tray table, which was definitely on the smaller side, and to make matters worse, the table was also slightly broken. But funny enough, I'd still rather this over whatever the thing was on Frontier from earlier.
Agree.
Making my way down to the pouch, this one wasn't stained like the one on Frontier, and the safety pamphlet was in pretty decent shape too, which was nice to see. Now, similar to Frontier, everything on Spirit would cost you extra, meaning there was no free snacks, and even if you wanted water, that's going to cost you a whopping $4 just for a bottle, which is insane. Now, remember earlier when I said that these seats appear to be half decent? Well, after getting halfway through the flight, my back was starting to get a little bit sore, but luckily nowhere near the pain of Frontier. So I decided to make my way to the bathroom in order to give myself a little break. Now, we all remember Frontier's bathroom, which had panels taped to the wall, being a complete disaster. But luckily, the bathroom on the Spirit flight was surprisingly clean and everything you'd normally expect, and the headroom was also quite good. But the only downside I will say is that the floors were quite sticky. But anyways, after making my way back to my seat, we had started our descent into Fort Lauderdale, and after narrowly missing an oncoming storm, we arrived at the airport with a pretty solid landing.
Woo!
So now the big question remains, which is truly America's worst budget airline? Well, I don't think this one needs much of a debate because just like the reviews say, I'm going to have to agree with them and say that Frontier was definitely the worst. But if you enjoyed this video, make sure to check out this.
And that is today's video. In my opinion, from what I saw, the worst flight from this video, Frontier. You got to do better. You got to take care of your stuff. Come on, Frontier. Come on. Do better. Do better. But if you watch this all the way through, make sure you give this a thumbs up in the comment section. Thank you. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.